Hamilton and Verstappen have been enemies in some of Formula One's most brutal battles. But in Austria, something happened that made both names point toward the same target: Mercedes. A driver revolt, an official demand for an FIA investigation, and a question so dangerous that the entire paddock has to take it seriously. What did Mercedes have in Austria that made the sport's biggest voices stop arguing with each other and start demanding answers? Because this is not just about one car. This is about trust. Trust that the race result was real. Trust that every team is playing by the same rules. Trust that the FIA can catch the difference between genius engineering and something that should never be allowed. And here is the terrifying part. If Mercedes broke the rules, the fallout could shake the grid. But if Mercedes did not break the rules, and simply found a weakness nobody else saw, the problem may be even bigger. Because then every team has to ask the same question. Was Austria a Mercedes controversy, or proof that the rulebook has a blind spot? Hamilton knows how serious that is. Verstappen knows it too. And when two drivers with that much history are connected to the same demand, Formula One does not ignore it. It starts searching for what Mercedes was hiding. Subscribe to the channel. Austria was not supposed to become a trust crisis. At first glance, it looked like another race weekend where the usual Formula One tension would rise, explode, and fade. A few angry radio messages. A few suspicious glances across the paddock. A few teams asking questions, because teams always ask questions when a rival suddenly looks stronger than expected. But this time, the questions did not fade. They grew. And that is the first warning sign. Because in Formula One, a normal complaint is usually narrow. It focuses on one move, one car, one driver, one decision, one moment where someone feels wronged. Those complaints can be loud, but they often burn quickly. This felt different because it reached something deeper. It reached Mercedes. And once Mercedes becomes the focus of suspicion, the entire atmosphere changes. Not because Mercedes is automatically guilty. That cannot be claimed without the evidence. But because Mercedes is not an ordinary team in the emotional history of Formula One. Mercedes is one of the great modern powers of the sport. A team linked with dominance, precision, control, and years of making rivals feel like they were racing against a machine that had already solved the future. That kind of reputation never disappears. It follows every upgrade. It follows every sudden improvement. It follows every moment where a Mercedes looks just a little too stable, a little too quick, or a little too difficult to explain. And that is why Austria became so dangerous. Because when a team with that history is questioned, people do not only ask, what happened this weekend? They ask, what did they find? That question is the spark. And when Hamilton and Verstappen are connected to the demand for an FIA investigation, the spark becomes fire. Hamilton brings a unique kind of weight to this story, because his connection to Mercedes is unlike almost anyone else's. He knows what that team represents from the inside of Formula One's most intense battles. He knows how Mercedes thinks when pressure rises. He knows how small details can become race-winning advantages, and how a tiny edge can look invisible to the public while changing everything for the driver in the cockpit. So when Hamilton's name appears near a demand for answers involving Mercedes, the story becomes complicated. It is not just technical. It is personal history. It is legacy brushing against suspicion. It is one of the sport's most successful partnerships now living under the shadow of a question that nobody can ignore. And Verstappen makes the story even sharper. For Verstappen, Mercedes has never been just another rival. Mercedes was the mountain. The team that defined the standard. The operation that once made winning look almost automatic. The force that had to be challenged, studied, and eventually beaten. So when Verstappen is connected to pressure against Mercedes, it carries the feeling of unfinished history. The driver who rose against the Mercedes era is now part of a demand to know whether Mercedes has found something the rest of the grid missed. That is why this does not feel like an ordinary paddock argument. Hamilton and Verstappen usually create tension by opposing each other. Here, their names create tension because they point toward the same concern. And that is rare. Very rare. Because Formula One drivers are not naturally united when controversy appears. They protect their own race, their own team, their own advantage, their own interpretation of fairness. Even when they agree in private, they often avoid saying too much in public because every word can become political. So when a situation is described as a driver revolt, the meaning is serious. It suggests frustration has moved beyond private complaints. It suggests the drivers want clarity. It suggests the issue is no longer only about engineering meetings, team principles, or lawyers reading regulations behind closed doors. It has reached the people who actually have to drive beside the car in question. And that matters. Because drivers feel things before data becomes public. They feel when a rival car is unusually strong under braking. They feel when it exits a corner in a way that does not match what they expected. They feel when it is harder to attack, harder to defend against, or strangely stable in moments where other cars should be sliding, struggling, or losing momentum. That feeling does not prove anything, but it creates suspicion. And suspicion becomes powerful when enough people start feeling the same thing. This is where Austria made the story even more intense. The Red Bull ring is short. It repeats its patterns quickly. There are not endless corners where a car can hide a strange strength inside complexity. The lap brings the same comparisons again and again. Braking zones, traction zones, short bursts of speed, corners where drivers can sense exactly how a rival car behaves. At a track like that, a difference does not stay quiet. If a car has an advantage, people notice. If a car behaves unusually, people notice. If a Mercedes suddenly creates questions, those questions come back every lap. That is why an FIA investigation demand in Austria feels so dangerous. The track itself makes suspicion sharper. It gives drivers repeated moments to compare what they think should happen with what actually happens beside them. But there is a trap here. Suspicion is not evidence. A driver can feel something unusual and still be wrong about why it happened. A team can see a pace pattern and still misread the cause. Fans can watch a car look strong in one phase of the race and imagine a hidden explanation when the real reason is setup, tire temperature, fuel load, track position, or driver confidence. Formula One is full of false alarms. But the reason this one matters is that the demand for investigation means the question became serious enough to reach the governing body. That is the turning point. Once the FIA is pulled in, the issue stops being only noise. It becomes process. It becomes inspection. It becomes interpretation. It becomes the moment where Mercedes has to explain not just that the car was fast, but why it was fast in a way that others now want examined. And that is where the story becomes about trust. Because Formula One does not collapse when one team is faster. It collapses when people stop believing the faster team is being judged by the same rules. Fans can accept being beaten by brilliance. Drivers can accept losing to better execution. Teams can accept that a rival found a clever solution. What they cannot accept is doubt. Doubt changes the meaning of everything. A clean overtake starts to look suspicious. A strong sector time starts to look like a clue. A quiet FIA inspection starts to feel like a hidden scandal. A covered part in the garage starts to look like proof, even when it may be completely normal. That is the danger Mercedes faces now. Not only the danger of what the FIA may or may not find. The danger of being watched through suspicion. Because once a team becomes the center of a technical controversy, every action is reinterpreted. A careful statement sounds evasive. A confident denial sounds rehearsed. A normal garage cover looks like secrecy. A performance gain looks like evidence. That is how quickly trust can bend. And Mercedes knows this reality better than most. The greatest teams are always watched the closest, because the greatest teams have the ability to turn a small discovery into a massive advantage. They have the engineering depth, the data, the discipline, the money, the experience, the internal confidence to pursue ideas others might abandon too early. That is why rivals fear Mercedes even when Mercedes is not clearly dominant. They know what can happen if the team finds the right door. And Formula One is full of doors. Some are clearly open. Some are clearly locked. But the most dangerous doors are the ones hidden inside the wording of the rules. That is where every great technical fight begins. One team reads the regulation and sees a limit. Another team reads the same line and sees an opportunity. Then the FIA has to decide whether that opportunity is legal genius or a loophole that should never have existed. That is the line Mercedes may now be standing on. Again, the available source does not confirm the exact detail inside the car, the exact evidence behind the complaint, or the final FIA conclusion. So the truth must be handled carefully. But the tension does not need invention. The tension is already there. Because the demand itself tells the paddock that something about Mercedes raised enough concern for people to want answers beyond ordinary explanation. And that is where Hamilton and Verstappen become symbols of something larger than rivalry. Hamilton symbolizes knowledge. A driver shaped by Mercedes, familiar with elite engineering culture, aware of how powerful tiny gains can become. Verstappen symbolizes challenge. A driver built on refusing to accept weakness, refusing to accept vague answers, refusing to accept that a rival advantage is harmless just because it looks small from the outside. Together, their names make the question feel heavier. What did Mercedes have in Austria? Was it a clever solution? Was it a misunderstanding? Was it a legal advantage that frightened rivals? Was it something the FIA needed to examine because the rulebook itself was not clear enough? Those questions are not just for fans. They are for every team in the paddock. Because if Mercedes found something illegal, the sport needs consequences. If Mercedes found something legal, rivals need to know whether they can copy it. And if Mercedes found something that sits in the gray area, the FIA may have to decide whether to close the door before the rest of the season is pulled into the same argument. That is why Block 1 of this story is not really about accusation. It is about the moment suspicion becomes official. The moment drivers stop whispering and start demanding. The moment Mercedes stops being merely watched and starts being questioned. And the moment Formula One has to face the uncomfortable possibility that the biggest threat in Austria was not a crash, not a strategy error, not a bad pit stop, and not even a driver mistake. It may have been uncertainty itself. Because uncertainty is the one rival no team can outpace. It sits in the garage. It follows the car onto the circuit. It enters every conversation. It makes every future upgrade look suspicious before it even touches the track. And for Mercedes, that is the nightmare. Not just proving what happened in Austria. Proving that the trust around the team is still intact. Because once trust is damaged in Formula One, speed is no longer enough. You can be fast. You can be clever. You can be technically correct. But if the paddock believes there is something hidden, every victory becomes an argument. And that is why the next stage of the story is even more dangerous. Because once the demand reaches the FIA, the question changes. It is no longer only, what did Mercedes do? It becomes, can the FIA prove that the rules are strong enough to catch it, explain it, or allow it without breaking the faith of the entire grid? Now the pressure shifts directly onto the FIA. And this is where the story becomes even more dangerous. Because suspicion is powerful, but suspicion alone cannot decide anything. A driver can feel something is wrong. A rival can believe a car is behaving strangely. A team can look across the paddock and think Mercedes has found something too good, too sudden, too difficult to explain. But Formula One cannot run on feelings. It has to run on proof. That is why the FIA is now trapped between two forces that are almost impossible to satisfy at the same time. On one side, the drivers want clarity. On the other side, Mercedes deserves fairness. And in the middle sits the governing body, forced to answer a question that could reshape the entire conversation around the Austrian Grand Prix. Was Mercedes simply clever, or was there something inside the car that demanded official action? That sounds like a technical question. It is not. It is a trust question. Because every team on the grid already knows Mercedes can be brilliant. Nobody doubts that. Nobody in Formula One looks at Mercedes and thinks this is a team incapable of finding performance. That would be foolish. Mercedes has the people, the tools, the history, the patience, the structure, the culture of detail. So if Mercedes finds speed, that alone is not suspicious. The problem begins when the speed appears in a way that rivals cannot explain. And when rivals cannot explain something, they do what Formula One teams have always done. They start searching for the hidden reason. They look at the car from every angle. They study images. They compare bodywork. They listen to the drivers. They examine where the car was fast, where it was stable, where it seemed stronger than expected, and whether that strength appeared in a normal performance window, or somewhere unusual. Then they ask the FIA to look. That is how a private doubt becomes an official investigation. But once the FIA starts looking, the consequences can split in several directions. And every direction is dangerous. If the FIA finds nothing, Mercedes may be cleared, but the suspicion may not vanish. Because in Formula One, being cleared is not always the same as being believed. Fans may still argue. Rivals may still question. Drivers may still wonder whether the right thing was inspected in the right way at the right time. That is the cruel part. A clean result does not always clean the story. But if the FIA finds something clearly illegal, the shock becomes immediate. Then the issue is no longer about rumor. It becomes about consequences. Possible penalties. Possible changes. Possible questions over how long the issue existed, who knew about it, and whether it affected the competitive order. That is the version of the story that would shake the paddock fastest. But there is a third possibility. And this may be the one that frightens teams the most. What if the FIA finds something that is not clearly illegal, but not comfortably acceptable either? That is the gray area. And gray areas are where Formula One becomes its most ruthless. Because a gray area does not give the sport a simple villain. It gives the sport a problem. A problem in the wording. A problem in interpretation. A problem where one team may have found a path that others never saw, and the FIA now has to decide whether that path should stay open.